Today we'll be discussing the obligation to have the meal of Melavah Malka after Shabbos. Before we begin, as always, this should not be relied upon for halachic psak, and a rav should be consulted. So Melavah Malka is the meal that we have after Shabbos. It literally means escorting the queen. So I want to explain where the source is and some of the halachas that are relevant to the meal of Melavah Malka. So before we start the details, we have to figure out what's the source of this meal. So the Radvaz in Hilchos Matnas Aniyim Perek Tes Halacha Yud Gimel writes that he feels that the obligation to have the Melavah Malka is not really an obligation at all. It's midas chasidus. It's a nice thing. He says, "V'haditzna mi sheyesh le'mazen yudal sudas le'ital min akupa v'lei tzarich tesvav sudas minei sudas shlisha shel Shabbos v'yesh lo'imar she'asudas shayich mincha taspik l'matzei Shabbos v'yavagav the mitzvah le'echel matzei Shabbos k'mish malavis hamelach hanimil l'mada'ef shalei she'en kan chayva." What the Radvaz is saying is like this: the halacha was that if someone was very poor, the city was obligated to supply him with a certain amount of meals. Says the Radvaz, the city is not obligated to supply him with the meal of Melavah Malka. He says, even though there's a concept of eating a meal after Shabbos, Hani mil l'man de'ef shalei, that's if you have the food. She'ein kan chayva, it's not an obligation. Meaning, to have meals on Shabbos, it's an obligation, so we're obligated to supply the poor person with food. But Melavah Malka is not an obligation. So it's clear that the opinion of the Ravaz is Melavah Malka is not an obligation. The Mishabura in Siman Shin, Sifkat and Beis also feels this way. He says, "V'da, you should know, this meal of Melavah Malka ain't a chayva love. K'may hagimel sudah shel Shabbos. It's not an obligatory like the 3 meals of Shabbos. Deshama smulchu akra, because for the 3 meals of Shabbos, there's a source, there's a hint for it in the pasuk. V'zerak mitzvah ba'alma. Melavah Malka is a mitzvah, but it's not an obligation. V'nafka mina heicha diyeshel l'kaim kulam. And the nafka mina will be if you don't have enough food to have all the meals, it's better to eat the 3 meals than the Melavah Malka. The Sharatzian Sifkat and Tes, he adds v'chein heicha diyesh le'basar edagim kadayim v'tzimtzum mutav liyafis ben yoyser shalosh sudas. He says it's also relevant if a person only has a certain amount of meat or a certain amount of fish, and he wants to know what should he eat it for. What should he save it for? Says the Mishabura, save it for the 3 meals. It's better to have the 3 meals be nicer sudas, because those are obligations, than to have a nicer Melavah Malka, which is not an obligation. However, the Chayei Adam in Klal Ches Sif Lamed Vav seems to disagree. He writes the following: Ashrei Lamisha Mekayim Sudas Revius Bepas. It's a very praiseworthy thing to have the Melavah Malka, to eat bread. V'yinikra sudas Melavah Malka, and this meal is called Melavah Malka. And if you can't eat bread, then you should at least eat mizonos. V'zehu chayv gomer. This meal is an absolute obligation. That's what the Chayei Adam says. So to me, it appears that it's an machlokas between the Chayei Adam and the Mishabura and the Radvaz. The Chayei Adam writes that a chayv gomer, and if you look at the Tshuvas V'Hanhagas Chelik Beis Siman Kuf Samach Vav, Ramesha Shtermach writes Sudas Melavah Malka Hi Chiyav Midrabanan. The Melavah Malka is a Chiyav D'Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic obligation. He seems to agree with the Chayei Adam. He quotes from the Ma'aser Rav that the Gra was very, very makbid that his wife would eat the Melavah Malka. There was a case where she fell asleep, she wasn't planning on eating, and he told people to wake her up to have the Melavah Malka. I saw a very interesting thing, a fascinating thing in the Sefer Mincha Shabbos, in the Hashmatas to Siman Tzadi Vav Sifkat and Lamed, quoting the Sefer Noam Elimelech. It says the following: Sheskula lenashim shlo yiskashu b'leidasan, a skula for women to have a very easy childbirth. Hu sheyochlu b'chol matzei Shabbos, eiz davar l'shei mitzvos Melavah Malka. That every matzei Shabbos, the woman should eat something from Melavah Malka. V'af gam yoimru b'peh mole, and the woman should also speak out that she's eating l'shem mitzvahs Melavah Malka, that she's eating this food in order for the sake of the mitzvah of Melavah Malka. And says Rav Elimelech of Lezhensk, by doing this, by eating Melavah Malka and saying out loud, I'm doing this in order to fulfill the mitzvah of having this meal of Melavah Malka, it'll be a skula to help the woman give birth more easily. So it seems that it is either it's an obligation or it's a mitzvah. The halacha is that men, women, and children old enough to, as they say, old enough for chinuch, old enough to be trained in mitzvahs, are obligated in the mitzvah of Melavah Malka. There's a question though amongst the poskim, at what point should you eat the meal? So the Mishnah Berurah says, the kashem shetzarich lechabed hashabbos b'knisasa kein tzarich lechabda b'yitziasa. The Melavah Malka is in order to escort the Shabbos away. The same way you have to honor Shabbos by bringing it in with candles and kiddush, so too you have to escort it with honor. Kashem shad melavas hamelech b'tzeisem in the ear. The same way you would walk the king outside of the city. That's the concept of this meal. Umitam zeh nira. So says the Mishnah Berurah, it appears to me shetoiv l'hakdima kadei shitei smuch li'yitzias Shabbos. If the whole point of this meal is in order to escort Shabbos, to escort the Melech, the Malka away, then it's important to do it right after Shabbos. So right after Shabbos, you should stop what you're doing and eat the Melavah Malka. The Sefer Nezi Yisrael Siman Nun Vav Sifkat and Hey, he cites from the Sefer Yisod B'Sharish HaAvodah that the Melavah Malka cannot be eaten after 4 hours. Achar dalad shais balayla, 4 hours into the night, lo yotze yidei chavasa, you don't fulfill your obligation. Now that's the opinion of the Yisod V'Sharish HaAvodah. However, the Ben Ish Chai in Shana Bey's Parshas Vayetze Ois Chav Zayin writes, Afal Pi shenosnu lo shir ad achar arba shais. Says the Ben Ish Chai, although you're supposed to definitely get the meal in within 4 hours, hainu lemitzvah min hamuvchar. That's the opportune time to do it. Aval nenas yochel l'kayim achatzois laila. However, if you get pushed off, something comes up, you could push off them. You could do it until chatzos. The Mishnah Berurah also says, "Ayin shari tshuva demashma de'ena kedai b'chol gav ne'achar yosim mechatzos." That's also the Mishnah Berurah also says that under no circumstance should you be eating it. It should never be pushed off past chatzos. It should always be done by the time of chatzos. The Sefer Tamei HaMinhagim Kuntras Achroin Siman Tov Chav Hey writes the following: U'b'sefer Mishpat Tzedek Kasa b'shem Sefer Machzik Bracha b'shem Marsha v'chein Kasa Rabbeinu Rama Mipanu. The Rama Mipanu, the great Mekubal, writes, the Tov L'asa is davar mechudesh l'sudas Melavah Malka. The Ba'isuda b'anpei nafsha v'loy mishiroyim. Says the Rama Mipanu, it's important that this meal, it's its own meal, and therefore you should cook something special for the meal. It should not be leftovers of Shabbos. It's not a leftover meal. It's preferred that you cook something specifically for the Melavah Malka. It seems that this is not an obligation, but this is just a nice thing to do in order to show respect to the meal, that you should cook something special for it. Just to show the importance of this mitzvah, the Gra in Tosefes Ma'aser Rab Ois Kuf Nen writes, Pamachas Chola v'Hikia. One time he got sick and he threw up. Ukeshavriya Ma'at, and when he felt a little better, Tziva lo imdim lefanav liris imedayin lo ha'ir hashachar. Shilasu oisai kazayis pas ba'al karchai kedei l'kayim mitzvahs Melavah Malka. We said before that there are a couple opinions as to when Melavah Malka can go for. And the Nezi Yisrael says it can't go after 4 hours. The Mishnah Berurah seems to indicate that you can go until chatzos. So the Gra in Tosefes Ma'aser Rab once threw up, and he said check if it's not Omer HaShachar, if it's not already dawn. Because if it's not dawn yet, I could still eat a little bread for the mitzvah Melavah Malka. So clearly the Gra actually felt that b'di'evid, you could actually fulfill the mitzvah Melavah Malka until dawn. There are those, it's brought down by the Kaf HaChaim in the name of the Arizal, that make it a point not to remove their Shabbos clothing until after they have eaten Melavah Malka. Also, the opinion will end off with this. The Mishnah Berurah seems to say, if it's difficult for a person to eat bread, so we quote it from the Chai Adam, he should eat cake, or some other mezainis, or at least some fruit. And they bring down from Rav Yaakov Emden that if it's impossible, you might be able to fulfill your obligation by drinking a cup of coffee or tea. All questions could be sent to avizakatinsky@gmail.com, avizakutinsky@gmail.com.